Avoidants don't come back until you become emotionally unavailable. Let's talk about a dynamic that drives people crazy. And it's this. Why does the avoidant person seem to come back the moment you stop caring? Why is it that when you finally move on, when you're not checking your phone, when your heart starts beating for someone new, suddenly they're back? It's not magic. It's not fate. It's psychology. Avoidants are drawn to emotional distance. They get uncomfortable when things get too close, too intense, too fast. So when you're expressing love, showing up, being consistent, they run. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because closeness triggers their fear of intimacy. But when you become emotionally unavailable, when your energy shifts, when your attention isn't fixed on them anymore, they feel safe. Why? Because now they're not at risk of being consumed by your love. Now they become the chaser. Your distance becomes attractive because it's on their terms. But here's what you need to understand. The goal is not to become emotionally unavailable just to get them back. That's manipulation. The goal is to protect your peace so deeply that their presence or absence no longer dictates your worth. When you reclaim your emotional energy, something amazing happens. You stop performing for their attention. You stop begging for breadcrumbs. You become someone who doesn't need to be chosen. You choose. So yes, avoidants often come back, but only when you finally stop waiting for them, only when your attention becomes scarce. And by then the question becomes, do you even want them anymore? Avoidants are attracted to emotional distance, not emotional availability. This can be incredibly confusing for someone who is emotionally open and expressive. You show love, you offer consistency, you communicate clearly. Everything we're told are signs of a healthy connection. Yet the avoidant pulls away. They get colder, less responsive, more distant. It feels like you're being punished for caring, and that's one of the most painful dynamics in modern relationships. The root of this behavior lies in how avoidants perceive emotional closeness. While a secure person sees intimacy as safe and comforting, an avoidant sees it as threatening. When you get close, really close, it starts to trigger old fears of losing control, of being engulfed, of being emotionally dependent. They've usually learned at some point in life that closeness means vulnerability, and vulnerability feels dangerous. So their nervous system subconsciously signals retreat, protect, pull away. So when you're fully available, texting back quickly, showing up for them emotionally, expressing your feelings, they start to feel that the walls are closing in. You're not doing too much, you're just present. But presence to them is pressure. They don't know how to handle someone who genuinely wants them. So instead of leaning in, they back off. Now, when you start to pull away, not out of manipulation, but because you're hurt, tired, or finally done, they sense a shift. Your attention becomes scarce, your emotional investment lessens. Suddenly, you're not a threat to their independence anymore. You're safe again. The very thing they were pushing away becomes attractive because now it's not demanding anything from them. To an avoidant, emotional distance feels like freedom. It gives them space to breathe, space to re-engage on their own terms. And oddly enough, that's when they often resurface. Not because they've changed or because they've realized what they lost, but because the emotional climate has changed. You're no longer flooding them with warmth, so they no longer feel like they need to escape the heat. This dynamic isn't fair, and it certainly isn't sustainable. But it reveals a hard truth. Avoidants don't respond to closeness the way you do. They're drawn in when things cool off, not when they heat up. The more emotionally available you are, the more they withdraw. The moment your heart starts to harden, they inch closer. It's not healthy, but it's real. And recognizing this pattern is the first step toward protecting yourself from repeating it. Your emotional detachment creates a safe space for them. It sounds counterintuitive because we're taught that love grows in closeness, in vulnerability, in the willingness to show up for someone fully. But for an avoidance, that kind of presence feels like pressure. When you're emotionally invested, checking in regularly, showing care and concern, they interpret that as a loss of space. It activates their fear of losing autonomy, of being needed too much, or being emotionally responsible for someone else's well-being. But when you start to pull back, whether from frustration, self-protection, or finally recognizing your own worth, something shifts. You stop trying to fix the dynamic. You stop pouring all your energy into the connection. You stop asking where it went wrong. That emotional distance, even if unintentional, creates a sense of safety for the avoidant. Not safety in the sense of connection, but safety in the sense of freedom. They feel less watched, less expected to perform, less obligated to meet emotional needs they don't feel equipped to handle. It's in this new dynamic where you've become less emotionally available that they start to feel more drawn to you again. It's not because they've had a grand realization. It's not because they finally understand your value. It's simply because the emotional temperature has dropped to something more comfortable for them. Your silence no longer demands anything. Your distance doesn't confront them with emotional intensity. In that quiet, they feel in control again. And control is what makes an avoidant feel safe enough to re-engage. What they crave is connection without obligation. They want intimacy without the vulnerability that true intimacy requires. So when you were all in, they felt emotionally claustrophobic. But when you backed off, they could breathe. And in that space, they begin to wonder about you again. Your unpredictability becomes attractive. Your distance becomes magnetic. Suddenly, you're not emotionally overwhelming anymore. You're a mystery. And that mystery doesn't trigger fear, it triggers interest. This is why so many people say the avoidant X came back right when they stopped caring. It's not that your love was too much. It's that your presence represented emotional responsibility and they weren't ready or willing to take that on. But your detachment, that feels safe, that feels light, that feels manageable. And that's when they return, not necessarily for the right reasons, but because your emotional absence offers them what your presence never could, the illusion of intimacy without the weight of it. You should not become emotionally unavailable to manipulate someone. It's a tempting idea. Pull back, act indifferent, give them a taste of their own medicine, and maybe they'll finally chase you. But acting emotionally unavailable as a tactic is not the same as genuinely reclaiming your energy. One is rooted in insecurity, the other in self-respect. When you pretend not to care just to trigger a reaction, you're still deeply invested in their response. You're not actually detached. You're just wearing a mask and hoping they'll notice. This kind of emotional posturing quickly becomes exhausting. You're constantly checking your phone, overthinking what to say, curating silence, or crafting replies with the exact right delay. It's not empowerment, it's performance. And when you're performing detachment, you're still operating from a place of fear. Fear of losing them, fear of not being chosen, fear of not being enough. That energy always finds its way through. People can feel when you're trying to manipulate connection, even if it's subtle. It never creates safety. It creates confusion. Avoidants are already sensitive to emotional dynamics, even if they can't articulate it. When they feel your energy is inauthentic, when they sense that your silence is a test or your distance is a strategy, they don't feel pulled in, they feel watched, controlled, and that only reinforces their instinct to retreat further. Instead of drawing them closer, manipulation validates their fears about emotional entanglement. You might succeed in getting their attention for a moment, but it won't create trust, it won't build connection, and it won't heal the root issue. There's also a deeper risk here. When you fake emotional unavailability long enough, you start to blur the line between what's real and what's not. You condition yourself to withhold, to guard, to disconnect, not as an act of self-care, but as a defense mechanism. Eventually, it becomes harder to recognize your own needs. You stop expressing yourself honestly, not because you don't feel, but because you've convinced yourself that vulnerability is weakness. Over time, that doesn't just protect you from rejection, it also blocks you from genuine connection. True emotional detachment comes from knowing your worth. It's not about playing games. It's about refusing to give energy to someone who can't meet you with the same presence and respect. Manipulation might bring someone back temporarily, but it won't give you the kind of love that lasts. Real peace comes when you let go, not just of the person, but of the need to control the outcome. Reclaiming your emotional energy is the real transformation. It's not about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about deciding that your peace, your clarity, and your emotional well-being are more important than chasing someone who doesn't value them. For too long, you may have been stuck in the loop of proving your worth. You gave more, tried harder, stayed available, responded quickly, forgave too easily, and explained your feelings over and over, hoping they'd finally understand. But people who aren't ready won't suddenly become ready just because you love them harder. That's a truth most people learn the hard way. When you stop performing for someone's attention and start pouring that energy back into yourself, the dynamic shift. You're no longer sitting on edge waiting for a message, decoding mixed signals, or second-guessing your intuition. You begin to realize how much of your emotional bandwidth was being used to maintain a connection that wasn't mutual. That realization is both painful and liberating. You feel the void at first, but that space becomes fertile ground. It becomes the place where your confidence grows, where your identity reforms without their approval shaping it. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. Reclaiming your energy means learning to be okay with silence, even when it's uncomfortable. It means no longer needing to fix or explain, and no longer allowing someone's inconsistency to dictate how you feel about yourself. You stop waiting for closure from them, and instead, you stop giving it to yourself by choosing to accept what you already know. When someone's actions repeatedly show you that they're unavailable, you stop hoping for change. You start choosing yourself. There's also something magnetic about a person who is emotionally grounded, not in a performative way, but in a genuine, self-assured way. When you're no longer chasing, no longer emotionally entangled in someone else's ambivalence, you become more attractive, not just to others, but to yourself. You start to respect your own boundaries. You become someone you trust. And whether they come back or not becomes irrelevant because your worth is no longer tied to their attention. This is the moment where you stop begging for breadcrumbs and start demanding the feast you know you deserve, not from them, but from life. You give yourself what you were always waiting to receive from someone who couldn't give it. That's the transformation. Not in getting them to return, but in returning to yourself. By the time they come back, you may have outgrown them. That's the irony in these emotionally imbalanced relationships. The moment you finally stop checking for them, stop obsessing over what went wrong, stop hoping they'll wake up and see your value, is often the exact moment they reappear. But when they do, it doesn't feel the way you imagined it would. The fantasy you held onto for so long, the one where they come back, apologize, and finally give you what you always wanted, starts to feel empty. Because now you've changed. You're no longer in the same emotional place they left you in. When you've done the work to heal, to reflect, to sit in your own discomfort and move through it, you gain clarity. Clarity about what you need, what you deserve, and what you're no longer willing to tolerate. And with that clarity comes strength. The kind of strength that makes old patterns look less romantic and more exhausting. You start to remember all the emotional labor you carried, the conversations that went nowhere, the feelings you buried to keep the peace, the way you overextended just to maintain a connection that barely gave back. And suddenly, their return isn't exciting. You see them for who they really are, not who you hoped they would become. You recognize that their return isn't a sign of growth, but often a reaction to your absence. They didn't come back because they finally evolved. They came back because the dynamic shifted. And that realization takes the power out of their reappearance. You no longer see them as the prize. You no longer mistake their attention for love. You finally understand that presence without consistency is chaos, not connection. It's not that you hate them or feel bitter. You may even feel a strange kind of compassion, but that doesn't mean you'll go back because going back would require shrinking yourself again, ignoring your needs, softening your standards, quieting your voice. And you've worked too hard to do that. You've redefined your value not as someone who waits to be chosen, but as someone who chooses. So when they come back, you're not standing in the same spot where they left you. You've moved forward emotionally, spiritually, mentally. You've grown. You're no longer trying to fit into the old dynamic. You've outgrown it. And when you truly outgrow someone, no amount of sweet words or nostalgic energy can pull you back, because you don't just want love anymore. You want peace. You want partnership. You want depth. And now you know the difference. So what does all of this really come down to? It comes down to no longer negotiating your self-worth through someone else's confusion. It's realizing that the more you show up for yourself, the less interested you become in people who disappear when things get real. You don't need to shrink to keep someone close. You don't need to play games, pretend not to care, or manipulate detachment just to be seen. The right person won't need you to dim your light to feel safe. And maybe, just maybe, the person you thought you needed isn't the one meant to grow with you, because the version of you who chased them was rooted in lack. But the version of you who walks away, that's the one standing in power. That's the one who attracts not just attention, but alignment. So when the avoidant comes back, and they usually do, the question will no longer be, will they choose me now? The question will be, do I still choose them? And with everything in you, you'll know the answer. Thank you for listening, for showing up for yourself, and for being willing to hear what might be uncomfortable, but necessary. Growth isn't always pretty, and healing rarely happens in a straight line. But if you're here, you're already doing the hard part, choosing truth over fantasy, self-worth over validation, and peace over performance. Take care of your heart, protect your energy, and always remember, the right love doesn't confuse you, it clarifies you. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.